if you want to follow along the book, this is example number 16 in the book, which is a few pages into the lesson. Page 65. And now we're going to start seeing how these work. Consider the following sentence. Shema HaMelech El HaNevi'im. Translate. You can do the sight unseen. Shema, he heard or listened. Again, this is the verb, so this must be the subject. Who listened? The king listened. El HaNevi'im. To the prophets. Prophets. Good. Now, what tense is Shema? Parsing. Perfect, right? Perfect. Okay. What is supposedly the technical pattern of these narrative sequence sentences is that they start with the actual perfect as the past tense. So that supposedly the first tense in a long sequence is in fact the perfect. But now look what happens. Here you have a past tense sentence. The king listened to the prophets. But how does the sentence go on? Vayishmor eth haTorah. Analyze the form Vayishmor. All right, you see shamar, right? You see yish, but now the next question, and here's a new question that we have to answer every time we see a wow. Is it wow consecutive or not? Yes. It's clearly marked by the pathak dagish forte. Therefore, this form is imperfect while consecutive. And that is a very standard sequence. That is to say, you start with a perfect, and then the next one is imperfect while consecutive. And if the sentence would continue, the next one after that, the next verb, the prophet arose, perfect, and he went from his house, and he walked on the road. What tense would "and he walked on the road" be? Imperfect while consecutive. And he came to the city, imperfect while consecutive. You see how this works? And on and on and on and on and on and on and on. But in translational value, this imperfect while consecutive now is a past narrative. In fact, I'd like to say sequential action. Do you understand why they came to call these wow consecutive? Because what's being done here in a narrative is describing what happened next. Get it? All right, look at EG 17 real quick. Kara'u ha'anav nevi'im, verb subject. All right, kara'u is now plural. They karad. Who did? The nevi'im karad. The prophets cried out El HaMelech. Vayishmor HaMelech eth haTorah. What's the difference here between 16 and 17? Do you understand the difference in pattern? This is a perfect. This is an imperfect while consecutive. That's the same. The only difference here is we've switched subjects. Can you switch subjects between the first verb and the second verb? The example I gave you, the prophet arose and went from his house and went on the road and came to the city and went to the temple and said to the priest, all had the prophet as the subject. But you can switch these any which way you want. All right? The tense will stay in the while consecutive. The prophets spoke to the king, and the king listened. All right, one more, then we'll call it a day. 18. What's happening here? I sort of explain this. If you follow along in the book, and this is your assignment between now and this afternoon, is to read the chapter. Okay? And I think the text, the narrative in the chapter itself, though it's not written in Hebrew narrative style with lots of wows, the narrative in the chapter we'll begin to explain this. Remember I said back here that technically they're supposed to start with a perfect and follow it with all these imperfect while consecutives. Okay? However, you can just sort of imagine this, that if you have a chapter of the Bible and let's say it's got 50 verb forms in them, following this rule, how many of them will be perfect? 1. How many will be imperfect while consecutive? All the rest that follow it. Yeah? So that the dominant form is the imperfect while consecutive. Whether this is the historical explanation or not, I'm not sure, but the fact of the matter is that they essentially use the imperfect while consecutive just as the past tense, and they could even start right out with it. You have books of the Bible that start with an imperfect while consecutive as the first verb form of the book. Okay? So E.G. 18 sort of shows you how that works, all right? We just start the whole sentence right off with Vayikru. Oh, this is a mistake. That should be a schwa. Oh, dear. Rewrite the book. Don't worry about that, right? Vowel reduction. Vayikra'u hanivi'im. The prophets called. Now, what's the tense of Vayikra'u? Parse it. Kara. Imperfect, but while consecutive. So here's an imperfect while consecutive equals what tense value? Past. So translate. Vayikru ha-nevi'im el hamelech. The prophets cried out to the king, and the king kept the Torah. All right? 18 is the same as 17, except it starts right out with an imperfect while consecutive.